The Jonestown Massacre, Sweet Cyanide by Claire King and Sophie Liu. On November 18, 1978, the sun was shining through the dense rainforest in North Guyana, a lush country with a wide variety of colorful birds. The birds stood calmly, chirping cheerfully among the lush branches per usual. But in a nearby town, there was a distinct voice ringing through the air, addressing a crowd of over 900 smiling people, all of various races and appearances. Little did they know that only a couple hours later, only few would leave Guyana alive. The Jonestown Massacre exhibits the People's Temple's triumphant push towards mixed-race religions and warm welcome to those who were ostracized and rejected from society. It renewed the hope of many who had given up, forcing America to a rude awakening as to how cruel and inhumane its culture was. However, this triumph was short-lived and dissolved into the tragedy of the deaths of over 900 innocent people held under the grasp of an egotistical psychopath. On May 13, 1931, a boy named Jim Jones was welcomed into the world in Crete, Indiana. Neglected by his parents, he was raised by his neighbor, who often took him to visit her church. Growing up, he almost seemed like an outsider to other children. He was described as being mischievous and rowdy, as he would often be seen fighting off kids who bullied other children, rescuing stray pets, and taking home beggars. He, unlike other children his age who enjoyed hobbies like sports or art, began preaching to other small children in the community. As he grew older, he began to explore his religion and visited many churches in his small town, and began attending a Pentecostal church. Later in life, he stated that he attended a Pentecostal church because it was a reject, just like he was. When we first think about the 1950s, we don't normally picture a world where different races work together in unity. We don't picture blacks and whites celebrating religion together. We don't think of peace and harmony, and we don't think of equal rights. Instead, we remember separate bathrooms, we remember separate churches, we remember the tragic 16th Street Birmingham church bombing, sitting in different parts of the bus, and instead of the equality similar to which we have today, our minds immediately go back to the prominence of racial prejudice in society. There was no perfect society where the races worked together in unity, and nobody could picture colored people and white people working together, nevertheless practicing the same religion. America was falling apart, and it seemed like there was nobody to piece it back together. However, one man was holding his arms out to comfort those who had been beaten up by society, and his name was Jim Jones. Out of the chaos created by the societal issues, Jim Jones brought up revolutionary ideas which appealed to many distraught Americans. He was very passionately committed to civil rights. He adopted several children of color and treated them like they were his own biological children. Jim Jones's son, Jim W. Jones Jr., stated that in 1960, he was the first Negro child ever adopted by a white family in Indianapolis. If he hadn't been adopted by Jones Sr. and his wife Marceline, he would have ended up in foster homes or prison. With this view of American government, lack of civil rights, and frustration with capitalism, many were understandably looking for something different. Jim Jones and the People's Temple movement offered just that, equality through socialism. The People's Temple movement gave a sense of hope and purpose where the government and culture failed to do so. After several years of struggling to find his way, in 1952, Jones got a job as a student pastor at the Somerset Methodist Church in a poor, predominantly white neighborhood in Indianapolis. By the following year, Jones was making a reputation for himself in the state as a healer and evangelist. He was interested in holding racially integrated services, but this interest was not shared by his church. Soon, Jones decided to make his own church, creating the Wings of Deliverance Church in 1955. The church soon became known as the People's Temple. Jones had some alluring quality, a very charismatic way of speaking, and he had a very mesmerizing power as an orator. He dripped with charisma, his smile seemed deep and warm, and he cared deeply about everyone. He urged temple members to turn their paychecks to the temple, to sell their belongings, and turn nearly all of their assets over to the temple. Although many people were losing what little they already had, it increased the temple's membership from several hundred to approximately 20,000 at its highest.
Jones used fear of persecution to draw people into his community. Jim progressively became more focused on increasing his own power and changing how others viewed him rather than how others viewed God. He began forcing his followers to call him the Father, and he used a variety of methods to persuade his congregation that he had divine powers. Jones also forced the suppression of individuality. He claimed that he was a reincarnation of Vladimir Lenin and Jesus Christ, as the praising he required his followers to give him made him more and more narcissistic and egotistical. But because of his grasp on his followers, they were unable to escape the charisma and hypnosis that Jones emitted. In the earliest stages of his ministry and the peak of his accomplishments, Jones had seen himself as a shepherd that was guarding his flock, but he progressively viewed himself as the general and his followers as brainwashed soldiers that did anything he wanted. It was not that people didn't want to leave, it was that they couldn't leave and survive in the outside world. Jim Jones's high expectations tested the unquestioning devotion of his followers, and they eventually increased their dependence on him. Isolating them from anyone outside of the People's Temple, he decided to move them down to the lush country of Guyana in South America. He created a small town with around 1,000 residents called Jonestown. In Jonestown, only he and God were superior. Everyone else was simply equal. It almost seemed as if he believed himself to be a near equal to God. His sphere of influence grew stronger because, according to Laura Johnston Cole, a former temple member, in Guyana, he wielded more power over his congregation than he could have in the United States. There was no one in Guyana, in the People's Temple, who would stand up to him or even get him to reflect on what he was doing, so he was unchecked. In addition, a small 6-year-old boy was the catalyst that led to the tragedy. Tim and Grace Stowen gave birth to a little boy named John Stowen in 1972. Complicating the matters of the paternity, Tim signed an affidavit confirming that Jim Jones was John's father. When the couple left the People's Temple, John was already in Guyana, and Jones adamantly refused to hand him over. The dispute over John's paternity symbolized a bitter conflict between the temple and its opponents. If Jones lost, it would signal the loss of Jones's far-reaching power over his people and would galvanize other relatives of temple members seeking the return of their loved ones from Jonestown. In one sense, John Victor Stowen represented the most visible symbol in the battle between Jim Jones and the Concerned Relatives organization. Furthermore, if John Victor Stowen was to return to his parents, Jones would have lost more than just the boy he claimed as his own. He would have lost his claims of absolute power of protection for his followers. Another important aspect is that when Leo Ryan, a United States congressman, came to Jonestown, some of Jones's followers wanted to leave with Ryan and go back to the States. But Jones' thought was, if you let a few people go, then more and more are going to want to go. If you let this congressman leave, more congressmen will come. In a panic mode, Jones set armed temple members and killed the congressman and his crew. For residents in Jonestown, Congressman Ryan's visit was a culmination of the oppression they had felt when they were in the hands of the United States. Ryan's visit marked as an American invasion of their constructed space. In ensuing pandemonium, Jones said that because of the murders of the congressman and his crew, the temple would dissolve, which Jones predominantly stated that it was the one thing that had to be prevented at all costs. However, the price of defending their home was everything that the temple had offered, including the lives of all the members. He announced just before bringing out the flavor aid laced with cyanide and other drugs that a congressman has been murdered. And that means that the attack from the outside, the Americans, probably the Guyanese government, will come any minute. He says, they're going to slaughter us and take away our children. Isn't it better that we do it ourselves? We have this one last act of defiance. Jones explained to the parents why they must kill their children, was that if you don't take your children with you to what he called the other side, what will happen is the soldiers will come in and capture them, and they will be taken back to America, where these children will be subjected to terrible things, and they'll be brought up to be racists. Or if they're black, they'll be brought up to basically be slaves or subhuman. So the kindest thing we can do for our children and our old people is to take them with us and spare them from what's coming.
How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. No man takes my life from me. I lay my life down.
But it's obvious that Jones wanted his name engraved in history, and that would require something revolutionary, the deaths of his followers. Despite the fact that over 900 members of Jonestown were killed in a revolutionary suicide conducted by Jim Jones, the People's Temple was a safe haven for many of those that were under society's wrath. It may not have been a triumph through our eyes, but Jim Jones showed defiance against society's issues and had done many good things in the sense of humanity. Many adults didn't believe a revolutionary suicide was necessary and tried to protest but were forced to drink the Kool-Aid anyway. This resulted in the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until 9/11. The Jonestown Massacre showed us the major flaws in the American society. The fact that nearly 1,000 people tried to create a utopian society outside the confines of the United States shows the sad state of race relations in America at that time. But it also exposes the United States of America that they have a tendency to demonize those who are not members of the upper class. What had started as a triumphant religious movement had dissolved into a horrific tragedy.
And whatever you do, don't drink the Kool-Aid.